Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome back Sarah Morris to the show to chat about Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's 1502 royal progress. Sarah Morris, also known online as the Tudor Travel Guide, lives in England's picturesque Gloucestershire countryside. She's been enthralled by the Tudors since she was a child, learning about them at school and spending many happy weekends and holidays touring historic properties with her parents. With the seed planted early, her passion for places steeped in Tudor history was heightened when researching and writing Le Temps Viendra, a novel of Anne Boleyn, and her two co-authored non-fiction books, In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn and In the Footsteps of the Six Wives of Henry VIII. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Sarah. How are you?
I'm very well, Natalie. Thank you very much. I've been out running in the dark, grabbed a bit of breakfast and sat down. So I just hope that my brain is in gear for this chat today because there's so much detail to get through. So That's part of the challenge, actually. It's going to be not overwhelming everybody.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to talk about one of our favourite subjects. But before we dive into that, can you just please say hello to everyone, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Of course. So for those of folk out there who don't know me, I'm Sarah, and online I am the Tudor Travel Guide, but that's certainly not where I started out in life. I have a background as a trained doctor. I worked following that in the corporate world for a period of time before, as a sideline, a hobby, began writing first a novel called Le Temps Viendra, a novel of Anne Boleyn, and then you and I hooked up and two more books followed, the In the Footsteps books. And then there was a little bit of a break. And then in 2018, I came back and decided I was missing the Tudor world and writing too much. So I started the Tudor Travel Guide online, which has kind of just snowballed over time. I've been doing that, that's nearly 5 or 6 years now. And that has also led on to another iteration, another evolution of the Tudor Travel Guide when I co-founded Simply Tudor Tours, which is, of course, an in-person tour company founded by Tudor history lovers for Tudor history lovers. And that's a new venture. We did our first tour, as you well know, Natalie, because you were on it as our resident historian, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, just this September gone. So yeah, quite an exciting development for me and for us. And we're just thrilled at the way that's going.
Oh, that's so fabulous. And yes, we had an absolutely amazing time on tour. I can certainly testify to that. So it's wonderful. So we are actually going to talk about Tudor progresses, but we're going to talk about one specific progress, which took place in 1502. So before we dive in and look at that in more detail, can you tell us just a little bit about what a Tudor progress is and maybe just give us some general information about it?
Yeah, of course. So I was giving some thought to this. And, I think there are two types of progress. The first one is I would call very loosely a progress because, of course, the Tudor court, like the medieval court, was itinerant anyway. It moved around. But you do get these mini progresses from time to time, which are fairly abbreviated progresses. And when I think about it, I often think of 1533 when Henry VIII left Anne Boleyn at Windsor. She was pregnant. He went on a mini tour of the Thames. But then we come to what perhaps we would call the usual progress, the summer progress. And this was a time when the court up sticks, left the Thames Valley, left London behind, and started to perambulate throughout the country. Quite an undertaking, because although the whole court rarely went on a summer progress, there was still, of course, a significant number of people required to move the royal household from place to place. And all the furniture, the tapestries, the beds, the jewels, the plate, the food that needed to be pulled together to feed this itinerant court, quite an undertaking. And so what you would see is usually the geese or geise, and I know you and I never know particularly how to say that, would be published. That was the intended itinerary of the royal court for that summer. And they did have favoured circuits, I would say. So sometimes you see the court heading to the southern counties, to Kent, to Sussex, for example. Other times they may head north towards Grafton Regis. That was kind of the northern loop. And very occasionally they went even further afield, such as the 1535 progress that we wrote about with Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. And I suppose this particular progress we're going to be talking about touches on some of those places. There's a little bit of overlap between the two progresses. But I was also thinking, Nat, about, why the court went on progress. And I think there were there's sort of two or three things I usually say, but I've really been giving this some thought. And actually, I've come up with a few more, particularly thinking about the 1502 progress. So perhaps I'll just cover a few of those. I think the first one, perhaps the most obvious one, the first one that runs to mind, for me at least, it was a way of being seen in an age where being seen was the only way to communicate. It must have been an incredible sight, seeing the royal court on the move. What an impression it must have made on the commoners of England at the time. And you particularly see this type of royal assertion of authority in two of the progresses that I've already written about, and we co-authored one of them. First of all, you've got Henry VII's progress in 1486, where he heads up to York following the Battle of Bosworth. And that's a real statement of, look, I've arrived. I'm the king. And then thinking to 1541 with Henry VIII, again on the back of the Pilgrimage of Grace, doing a similar thing, heading up to the brute and beastly people of the north to put them in their place. And as we'll see there with 1502, it's a completely different story. And so I'm looking forward to contrasting that progress in this way. We then got the opportunity, of course, for the palaces around London to be cleaned and restored and repaired, because those 1,000+ people living there certainly left its mark, and places did need thoroughly cleaning. You've got the chance to escape the pestilence in large cities that often sprung up during the summer months. And we certainly saw quite a few examples in the 1535 progress of Henry and Anne avoiding the plague at all costs. Similarly, of course, we've got this idea about getting out to honour certain courtiers who were flavour of the month. And again, I hark back to the 1535 progress, the Reformation progress, where again, we definitely see Henry and Anne making a point of visiting those people who supported that marriage. And then actually a couple of others came to mind. I was thinking again and thinking, you know what? I think the other thing I've seen the royal couples doing is inspecting newly acquired properties, because they were always gaining new properties, particularly Henry VIII. And even if it wasn't on the back of the dissolution, they swapped properties all the time. I'll give you this property if you give me that property. And so I think it was an opportunity for them to see those properties and find out if they liked them, and what kind of money they wanted to invest in them. And I think we possibly see an example of this with Elizabeth of York in the 1502 Progress. And then finally, it's just simply a chance to escape the pressures of court, a chance to get away, as you and I would do. You've just been to Bali, Natalie, to get away from the pressures of the internet. Well, for them, they wanted sometimes just to escape, I think, get away from the press, the city, get away from the gossip at court, although I suspect they could never completely get away from it. But it was a chance to see different parts of the country. We know that they always did a lot of hunting and hawking and dancing and gambling and generally relaxing and enjoying themselves. And again, we certainly see that on this particular progress.
Yeah, it was a real mixture, wasn't it, of business and pleasure, and sometimes one was more focused than the other. But I was thinking, Sarah, as well, that was an excellent summary of why they went on progress. You know what I've noticed as well, that they sometimes went to check up on people. And I think perhaps this is more relevant for Elizabeth I, that tends to have done that so many times. But certainly I can think of progresses during Henry's reign where they do pop in to kind of see what someone's doing or how they're behaving. So it's absolutely fascinating. So in terms of, we're talking about the 1502 progress. So could you just set the scene for us a little bit and just tell us what is happening in England and maybe abroad, if you'd like to touch on that as well? And around this time, what are the sort of major themes that people are discussing?
Yeah, of course. And I think context actually for this progress, it is very important. And I'll come back and touch on this main theme, which I think you need to bear in mind when you're thinking about the 1502 progress. I talked about sometimes the aim of a progress was to assert royal authority. And I wrote in detail about Henry's progress to York in 1486. And you see so much pomp and ceremony, great state entries into the city of York, all sorts of civic receptions going on, banquets. He held a chapter of the Order of the Garter in York. It was a real time of asserting his newfound authority as King of England. 1502 is a completely different story, and that's solely due to the series of events that start to crash through Henry and Elizabeth's life, particularly from 1500, so a period of 2 years, culminating in the tragic death of Arthur, of course, in April 1502. So let me just talk through a few of those. And these are deeply personal losses that really profoundly, destabilized the Tudor crown, which had only just kind of got on top of a couple of pretenders. Henry had only just really managed to quell rebellion. At the turn of the 16th century, everything was looking stable as ever as it had done for the new Tudor dynasty. And perhaps Henry was thinking that he could relax. He had 3 sons and 2 live daughters. The dynasty was secure. And then, sadly, tragically, on the 19th of June, 1500, the couple suffer the first of these losses. And that's the death of their youngest son, Edmund, who dies at just 16 months old. Well, okay, tragedy, but at least there's still an heir and a spare. We've got Arthur and we've got Henry. But only just a few months after that, we get another loss of great significance to Henry in particular, and that's the death of John Morton, who was Henry VII's Lord Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury, and he dies. And John Morton had been such a pivotal figure for Henry. He was one of those people who'd stood by him and been a stalwart ally and advisor and friend. And that must have cut deeply for the king. We take over into 1501 and more trouble begins to brew when we have Edmund de la Pole, who absconds without permission of the king to the court of the Emperor Maximilian. And he joins his brother, Richard de la Pole. Then, of course, we know that they had a strong claim to the English throne. And so this was a threat on the chessboard of strategic manoeuvring between the House of Lancaster and York, and must have been hovering there in the background, creating a degree of tension for the Tudor crown. But I have to say, there was some happiness in 1501. So basically, Arthur, of course, marries Catherine in November of that year, which was a much fated dynastic allegiance with Spain. Great celebrations, of course, at St. Paul's and the City of London before the couple head off to set up their married household in Raglan Castle. And we've also got, at the beginning of 1502, as the year ticks over, we've got Margaret becoming effectively engaged to the King of Scots and therefore effectively Queen of Scotland. So another successful dynastic match, and Henry and Elizabeth must have been delighted. But then, of course, we know that like 3 months later, they received this egregious news that their heir, their beloved Prince Arthur, had died suddenly at Raglan Castle. And that, of course, threw everything up in the air. And we know from the accounts just how grief-stricken they both were. And Elizabeth, of course, pledges to Henry that they're still young enough to have children. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. Within a month, Elizabeth is pregnant again, but she's 36 years old, and this is her 7th pregnancy. And I think it's fair, I think I'm right to say that some of those pregnancies have not been easy for her. So an incredibly risky thing for her to do. And I think just shows her utter commitment to her role as a Tudor queen and as a devoted wife in trying to secure the dynasty. So therefore, we roll into the summer of 1502, and we have a situation where suddenly Henry and Elizabeth perhaps don't feel as secure on the throne as they were just a couple of years earlier. And not only that, they've had to, in the space of 2 years, they've had to grieve the death of 2 of their sons and at least 1 devoted, stalwart ally. And therefore, that makes the context for this progress unique. And now I want to give full credit to Samantha Harper, who was one of the team who digitalized the Queen's Chamber books that you can read online, and actually, which is, and perhaps we'll come to talk about this, one of the main sources for understanding where they went on progress. And she said to me, and I thought, this is absolutely right. There is something profoundly different about this progress. It's not a state progress. It's not a progress of asserting royal power and authority. This was more like a trip down memory lane, because we see that Henry is heading for one of his childhood homes during the course of this progress. That's Raglan Castle in Monmouthshire. And it very much feels like a journey of grief and healing. And perhaps I should at this point note that there has previously been some misconception that Elizabeth did this progress alone, and therefore there must have been a rift in the marriage. But actually, this comes as a misreading of the records available to us. But unfortunately, because it was quite a well-known historian who wrote about this, I think it's become quite entrenched. And it was rather enlightening to understand that, in fact, the couple did this progress together. But the feel of the progress is entirely different. We do not see any state entries, and there seems to be a great lack of pomp, and instead meeting up with particularly, people that they may have known of old.
What an emotional roller coaster. I don't think there's ever a boring day at the Tudor court, that's for sure. And I think you've summed up that really beautifully, the context. So before we go and look at places they visited and people they stayed with, can you just touch on, you spoke about the sources there, can you just talk a little bit about what the main sources are that you used for reconstructing this particular journey?
Yeah, there's a few, so I'll touch on those. The main one, as I've already mentioned, is the Queen's Chamber books. These were basically the account of Elizabeth York receiver, a guy called Richard Dickens, or Deacons even, Dycons. So this kind of records the expenditure of the Queen's household and gives us an idea of what she was spending her money on. So you get an idea of who she's giving money to, where she is, what her interests are, what her religious inclinations are, who she's writing to and sending gifts to, who she's receiving gifts from. So it's a snapshot of the accounts, or let's put it this way. It's a window frame into a snapshot of her everyday life. And I think in a way, again, this progress and these documents allow us to build up a little bit more of a picture of the Queen and the woman. And of course, for Elizabeth of York, we only ever get glimpses of her because we don't have the same extensive records for her as we do for other later queens. Now, I did mention this, the Winchester Project. This was a project, a labour of love, undertaken by three historians, Margaret Condon, Samantha Harper, and James Ross. Effectively, it covers a period between 1485 and 1521 and accounts for 12 ledgers of accounts. So that's primarily where we're looking at. And that's the main source for me of following where Elizabeth went on the progress. And thankfully, from time to time, you have these entries, which usually to a groom of the chamber for conveying the Queen's jewels, and it lists very, very conveniently exactly where she goes along the way. And then also, of course, with the other entries, you can paste that together and start to get a little bit of a fuller picture of sort of the everyday goings on while she was making those movements from place to place. There is also, of course, the King's Chamber Books, which is an account of the receipts and expenditure of the King's household by the Treasurer of the King's Chamber, a certain John Heron. And it's those books that allow us to tally dates as to where Henry was, and we can see that they match up with the account books of the Queen. So we can see he's away for 6 weeks, and we can see there are certain entries that tell us, for example, he's at Cobberley at the same time there's an entry in the Queen's. So I think we can fairly safely say that at least for the majority of this progress, there's possibly one exception where they diverted for a period of time, but we don't really know, but that they were together. Another useful source that I urge people perhaps to look up is a thesis by Lisa Ford, which was published in 2001. And at the back of that thesis, she has the appendix of the entire travels of Henry VII throughout his life. And you and I both know from our work with Henry VIII how amazingly useful that is. But you do actually get to see just how incredibly travelled Henry VII is. I don't think people give him enough credit as to how much he moved around, and he does. Anyway, I won't dwell on that. It's another story. Then, of course, because I'm looking at places, there's usually a wealth of information written by local historians or experts on particular places. So I'm very much looking to find out about the history of a place, as much detail as I can, particularly detail about what it looked like during the visit. And as we did in the Footsteps books, I'm always trying to pinpoint the exact location that I think they visited or stayed in, maybe to find out, is he still there? And in fact, there were a couple of occasions, one in particular I can think of, Flaxley Abbey, which we'll come back to, where I believe the chambers they stayed in still exist. Sadly, it's a private home, but it's amazing what turns up. And then, of course, there are local historians. There are local history societies. There are experts on particular subjects that I liaised with, I met up with, I spoke with and corresponded with. And then, I suppose in a similar frame, the owners of some of these properties opened their doors to me. For example, what a fascinating day I had visiting Beverston Castle, which the apartments they stayed in are still there, but are in ruins, but you can get into them. And saw this amazing 15th century chapel, which would have been part of the Privy Chamber block that I suspect very few people have actually seen. So I had a great time doing that. You and I both know what fun that is. It's the getting out that's the real fun bit. And that's the last source of my information. It's just site visits. It's amazing what you see when you go and stand in a place, what you appreciate that you didn't appreciate before. And I think that brings even more colour to the picture. So yeah, those were the main places I turned to.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that last one. I think I felt that so strongly when we were writing about Catherine of Aragon and locations where she'd stayed. And I'd been in Spain, in the south of Spain, visiting the Alhambra Palace, and then went to Ludlow Castle. And I love Ludlow. Nothing against Ludlow, but I really understood the homesickness that Catherine must have felt. Whereas before I sort of theoretically got it, but I think standing there and having stood in both those locations, I just really felt what she must have felt, which must have just, torn her apart. Because they can't be any more different, can they, Sarah, those two locations?
No, absolutely no way. I mean, I don't think I've been to Ludlow yet on a fine, sunny, dry, hot day. Every time I go, it's grey, it's rainy, it's damp, it's cold.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And compared to, the south of Spain, which and people that have visited, they know, and the smell of the citrus trees at the Alhambra and the fountains and the sort of airiness of it really struck me. So exactly, once you're sort of standing in those places, there are insights to be gained, I think. And it's, you mentioned, of course, Elizabeth of York's accounts there. It may sound kind of dry, but I have to say I love those accounts. They're among some of my favorites because we do get a snapshot, a sense of the woman, don't we? Her cheese being delivered, just the little kind of details that make her so human. So I absolutely love all of that. So let's talk a little bit now, Sarah, about who actually accompanied the court. And I know this is a difficult thing to establish at times, but maybe you can just tell us about some of the people that were with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in this particular progress.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I will just reiterate that I really looked in detail at Elizabeth's account. So I didn't go through and look at who was with Henry. He would have had his own household, no doubt. But you do see snapshots of people coming through for all sorts of different reasons. Everybody from her chief lady in waiting, a lady called Eleanor Verney. And I can tell you a bit more about some of these people if you'd like. But right the way through to we see, I think it's Hugh Dennis, who's the groom of the stool to Henry VII, makes an appearance. I think he takes receipt of the clavichords that were delivered to her at Raglan Castle. And then right the way through to unnamed people who turn up just to give, I was just reminding myself yesterday, to give gifts of cake and pears, or as you point out, and I love it, just makes me smile, the Prior of Lantony Priory is constantly sending Elizabeth his famous cheese. And I would love to know what Lantony Priory cheese actually is, because I don't think it exists anymore. But anyway, that's that. We're getting off track. So I think the people that I saw most of are some of her ladies who are mentioned from time to time. And some of them, it is possible to say, yes, that is, for example, Lady Verney. Other times you get something received by the Lady Catherine. And it's not entirely clear who Lady Catherine is, particularly because there are so many Catherines. But, for example, when the court arrives at Woodstock, so they've travelled from London up to Woodstock. And I also perhaps should note that I particularly looked at the loop that they went on from Woodstock to southeast Wales, Monmouthshire, and then back again. Of course, they had to get from London to Woodstock and back, but I chose not to look at that. I wanted to really focus on that return, that whole loop of, by the way, 120 miles, which took them 8 weeks to cover in total. So going back to Woodstock, we hear about Mistress Anne Say. Now, it looks as though she was a young maid of honour, probably, from what I can tell, 13 years old. And she was ill. She fell ill at Woodstock alongside Elizabeth, actually. They were both poorly. It's difficult to say whether Elizabeth was suffering some kind of morning sickness because she recovered enough to obviously continue the progress. Whereas, for example, Anne Say ended up staying at Woodstock for the entire length of the progress. And the Queen was sending her money and gifts and making sure, obviously, that she was okay. And then we have, for example, as I mentioned, Lady Verney. Lady Verney, it appears, was one of her favoured women, one of her chief gentlewomen. She attended Elizabeth at her coronation. She went on, in fact, to serve not only Elizabeth of York, but both of her daughters, finally ending up in the household of Catherine of Aragon. In fact, she had a fascinating life. One of those characters, and I write about this in my write-up, that was never the centre of events, but stood and witnessed so much. It's one of those people you'd love to have a good chat with, because she married Sir Ralph Verney, and they were sent up to Scotland with Margaret when she was to take up her position of Queen of Scotland. And then they also, I'm sure both of them would have, certainly Sir Ralph was the Lord Chamberlain to the young Princess Mary when she was sent over to France. So I suspect they were kind of, I don't know, they seemed like the couple that got sent off to go and look after these young princesses as they got established in their new households and in their new position of Queen of. Yeah, and she comes back and she then ends up as Catherine of Aragon's household. She gets given, at one point, Henry VIII gives her a ton of wine a year for the rest of her life. So she's obviously in high esteem. So, you know, we do get glimpses of these folk coming through, but in the records, it will just say something like money received into the hands of Lady Verney. You don't really get any more detail than that. So, yeah, but other than that, it's difficult to say. We don't, as far as I know, we don't have any idea about how many people were on Progress. We probably have more idea about who the likely hosts or the hosts were at some of these properties that they went to.
Yeah, it is tricky, isn't it? So you're right. I think once you've got the property, you can kind of nail down the family that lives there, can't you? But just a lady or a Mistress Catherine is a tricky one. So let's talk about some of these places and people now.
Yeah. So would you like me to cover some of the places? I mean, I have to say there's probably about 10 different locations. If we talked about all of them, we'd be here probably for the next 3 hours. So I don't intend to do that. But I was going to pull out a few of the different locations, maybe talk a little bit more in more detail. So what I could do is start at the beginning and tell you place to place where they went, but then stop at some of those places and maybe go into. And please feel free to interrupt and ask me questions. Otherwise, it will probably just be one great big diatribe from me. So feel free to dive in there. So just to give listeners an idea of where we are in the year, it's mid-July by the time the royal court arrive at Woodstock in Oxfordshire. Woodstock, one of the 6 great houses of the royal household, which means it could take up to 1,000 people, i.e. the hold court. Very popular medieval palace. And even Henry VII fell in love with it because we know he invested a huge sum of money in renovating, repairing and building at Woodstock, to the point that above the gatehouse was a kind of a rhyming couplet, which basically translated into Henry VIII builded these buildings. He said, Henry VII, builded these buildings. So he had a lot to do and obviously loved Woodstock. And the court stayed there for a good couple of weeks. Now, that may be because there was sickness and Elizabeth fell ill during that period of time. But it may have just been, it's a beautiful place. It's got a lot of hunting. It was time after coming from London, time to spend some time, which received cheese from the
That's right.
Priory of London Priory and butts sent from the nearby forest of Cornbury by Lord Mountjoy, etc. I'm not going to linger over Woodstock, though. I'm going to move us on through to the old manor of Langley. They went there around the 5th and 6th of August and stayed for a few days. Again, I'm not going to linger over Langley either because I've talked about Langley previously. We've written about Langley. So if anybody wants to read more about it, apart from my current write-up, which I am hoping to publish at some point, you can read about Langley in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn. On the 9th of August, they reached their next destination. So what I'm going to do, actually, I forgot to mention, Natalie, I've written this up for my membership, the Ultimate Guide for Exploring Tudor England. I've written every single entry for every single location. It's only available to my members. But what I thought I would do is make the introductory blog, which includes a map of the progress, public for the period of duration after you publish this. So folk, if you're listening, if you want to actually see a map of the progress so you can get a visual of this while I'm talking, I will make sure that when you publish this, Natalie, I'll put it as available to everybody.
Wonderful.
No worries. So they're heading, just to give you an idea, they're heading from Oxfordshire down into Gloucestershire. They're heading in a southwesterly direction. They arrive at the town of Northleach. Northleach is not far from where I live, actually, just off a major Roman road called the Fosse Way. We don't know really where they stayed in Northleach or with who, but I do raise the point that during the medieval and Tudor period, Northleach was the epicenter of the wool trade in Europe, which is quite phenomenal if you go and visit today, because it's this sleepy little Cotswold town with this hugely oversized wool church. which always gives you a clue to the fact that during the medieval and Tudor period, it was rich, it was wealthy. There were some wealthy wool merchants who were able to pour their money into the church. And in fact, I think that's probably who they stayed with, one of the wealthy wool merchants, because in the church, in the side chapel of the church, belonging to William and Margaret Bicknell, there are two carved faces up in the ceiling, and they are crowned. And one is thought to be Henry VII and the other Elizabeth of York, which may suggest that they put those up there in celebration of the visit, but we don't know. But it is interesting because this is a theme that we'll come back to at the end of the progress, and I'll linger a little bit longer over one of the final entries at Fairford, because schmoozing the wool merchants of the Cotswolds was one of Henry VII's favourite pastimes, as far as I can make out, because they had very deep pockets. And what I learned through writing this progress was how dependent the crown was upon wealthy commoners like the wool merchants to fund various endeavours, shall we say, that the crown wanted to get into. So I'll come back, talk a bit more about that. Then they go to Cobberley. Did we go to Cobberley together? I think we did, didn't we?
I don't think, I think Cobberley was one that you went to, actually.
Cobberley was one of these great, fantastic locations to write about. We had touched on it in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn, but I managed to unearth more information this time round. And fabulously, we have an engraving of Cobberley Hall by Kip from the 1700s, which essentially shows this triple courtyard manor house, which was, in fact, the home of Giles Bridges, who, by the time of the visit, was a keeper of the body to Henry VII and also Sheriff of Gloucestershire. Cobberley's a tiny village, and although there is nowhere in the records that it says they stayed at Cobberley Hall, as you and I know, Natalie, when you do this enough, you get a sixth sense, don't you, about
absolutely
where these... It's almost a matter of form. We used to call it form. Yeah. You know, what is the kind of location that they'd stay at? And Cobberley Hall, triple courtyard manor house, and you have somebody who is in service of Henry VII, it had to be where they stayed. He was very loyal. Sir Giles was very loyal to Henry. He fought against the Cornish rebels and also at Exeter against the pretender Perkin Warbeck. So we know that there was a good connection there. Interestingly, his son, I don't know whether the name means anything to you, Natalie, Sir John Bridges.
Well, yes, I've definitely heard of him, and I can't now picture where I've heard of him.
Yeah, I think he's one of those names that you go, oh God, I've heard of him. He ended up being Lieutenant of the Tower during later reigns, Mary I in particular, and he was the guy who oversaw the imprisonment of Lady Jane Grey, Thomas Wyatt the Younger, Princess Elizabeth. He went upon the block with Jane Grey, and he eventually became Baron Chandos of Sudeley, courtesy of Henry I. So we're in that part of the world, you know, we're in Gloucestershire, we're in the Cotswolds, you know, you start to see these linkages between properties, including Sudeley Castle, for example. So they only stayed briefly at Cobberley, probably only a night. There's very little there except some walls. And at the outer courtyard is largely intact. There are more modernized farmhouses. The church is still there that once sat adjacent to the manor, but unfortunately, the rest of it is gone. They then travel on towards Gloucester, possibly passing through Prinish, or it's spelt Prink-Nash, but
oh yes, I remember that from when we wrote about it.
Apparently, it's called Prinish Abbey, which was the country seat of the abbots of Gloucester. It sat not too far out of the city. And in fact, it's still wonderfully a monastery today with a small number of monks. And I got to visit, which was a lot of fun because, of course, being a woman, you're not normally allowed. So I had special permission to go in because there is a carved boss on the ceiling at Prinish, which is of the Etterlock and Falcon, so the badge of the House of York. And it's thought that that was in commemoration, or possibly in commemoration of that visit. Interestingly, there used to be a set of stained glass windows in the dining room there, which have since been moved to the cloisters of Gloucester Cathedral. So if you go, you'll see them. They include the arms of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, Edward VI, from a period of building of 1520 onwards, when the Abbot of Gloucester, prior to the dissolution, upgraded the building. Anyway, that is a bit of an aside. I'm sorry, I do get carried away. So they travel through Gloucester. They stay probably at the Vineyard. I'm not going to dwell on the Vineyard. That was another retreat of the abbots of Gloucester that overlooked the city. And then they were heading southwards, past through the Forest of Dean towards Monmouthshire. And I want to stop at perhaps Flaxley Abbey, which I mentioned earlier. I don't know if you've ever heard of Flaxley Abbey.
I have actually.
I think you've looked at the 1502 a little bit, haven't you?
Exactly. And I was so excited when I saw Flaxley Abbey. I was really excited.
Yeah, and me too, because it's one of those locations that I'd certainly never seen. And so it was a bit of a thrill to jump in the car and go in search of Flaxley Abbey, or what remains of it, because thankfully something does still stand. So let's imagine it's the height of summer now. It's the 13th of August. It's a month since they arrived at Woodstock. They're heading through the depths of the Forest of Dean along an old Roman road, probably called the Via Julia, which connected Gloucester to southeast Wales. And they arrive at this abbey, which actually was a really important abbey for medieval monarchs. The early Plantagenets absolutely loved the place and visited regularly. And it is in the most beautiful, tranquil spot. I think it's the Vale of Castillard, I think is what it's called. It was never a very wealthy abbey, in that they were constantly having to host royal visits. And also there was a constant stream of pilgrims almost past the front door, heading from southeast Wales towards Gloucester to visit the tomb of Edward II and William of Normandy. So never very wealthy, about 13 monks, but a much loved resident. And unusually, because it had so many royal visitors during the medieval period, in the cloisters, they had part of the cloisters that had specific set of rooms for the monarchs, and it was called the King's Hall, the King's Chamber. So although we don't know when Henry and Elizabeth rode through the outer gatehouse and no doubt were received by the abbot of the monastery, we don't know for sure where they stayed. I'm almost certain it must have been in this suite of rooms. It was on the eastern side of the cloister of the abbey. And at the dissolution, in fact, just before it was closed and sold, there was a massive fire at Flaxley Abbey, and it pretty much burnt the church down. But part of the building survived, including part of this range of cloisters, and it was sold to Sir William Kingston. Again, we're not far from Kingston territory at Painswick, where he had one of his base and would later be buried. And he basically did what a lot of Tudor courtiers did at the time. They took the monastic buildings and they converted it into luxurious lodgings. And so that is why I believe we've got this one range of the cloister that still survived, which I think that the royal couple would have stayed in, with the Abbot of Courts presiding as host. The building now is under private ownership, and despite my best efforts so far, it's one of those locations where the owners seem very unwilling to share their history.
What a pity.
Yeah, I know, isn't it just? So they stay there again just for a night. They move on through the Forest of Dean. They need to get guides. There is a record of people being paid to guide them through the dense forest. And they emerge, crossing the English border into Wales. So we have finally arrived in Wales. And we come to the town of Monmouth, and particularly Mitchell Troy, which had a manor situated just outside the town of Monmouth, which is an important strategic town during the medieval period, I think birthplace of Henry V. And it's an interesting place, this old Mitchell Troy. There is a house still on site today, but it's been extensively renovated and Georgianized. So part of the medieval and Tudor house does exist, but it's almost built into the fabric of the existing house. But thankfully, we do have some really good description. We have some maps, we have an inventory, and we have the sterling work done by a lady called Anne Benson, who's written a book about Troy House, the history of Troy House, also how it has changed architecturally over time. So we actually know quite a lot. And in fact, Troy House, the royal couple, Elizabeth and Henry, stayed there for a week. So this is the longest time they stayed in any property since they've been at Langley, which is King's property. Now they are the guests of it's Sir William Herbert, who is the illegitimate son of the first Earl of Pembroke, another William Herbert, and probably his wife, Blanche. Interestingly, Blanche she was called Lady Herbert of Troy, and she actually went in to serve in the royal household as Lady Mistress, taking care of the future Edward VI and Mary I and Elizabeth I.
Oh, yes, Lady Troy from Elizabeth's household. I just saw her today in an account, actually, Sarah. What a coincidence.
You see, I love those links, don't you?
Yeah, Lady Troy. There she was, serving a very young Elizabeth. Lady Elizabeth, actually. By then, Anne had been executed. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. So Lady Blanche, Lady Herbert of Troy. In fact, the visit of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York is mentioned in her funeral eulogy, which is one of the reasons why I think people believe that she probably was mistress of the household and actually there during that visit. As I say, there is an inventory from the 1550s, which talks all about the suite of the king's rooms and how it was decorated, in the usual gaudy fashion of silks and satins, all sorts of interesting combinations of colours. And we know that Elizabeth had 2 chambers. I think the king had 3. Elizabeth had 2 allocated to her. And I think although the inventory was taken 50 years after the visit, Anne Benson states that very little had actually happened to the house in the interim. And so we can be quite confident that what gets listed there, including the furnishings, were probably there during the 1502 progress. I really wanted to mention Mitchell Troy because of the artifact that still survives believed to be associated with the visit, which I had the pleasure of seeing in person. There is a chasuble. In fact, it's rumoured that 2 chasubles were gifted by Elizabeth, but the provenance of one is a bit shaky. The other one we're much more certain about. And it was supposedly gifted by Elizabeth to Monmouth Priory, which can be found in the town. The Abbot's Lodging still survives. It's a community centre where you can go and do your yoga, but the outside is distinctly medieval. And it's a chasuble, which is a garment. It's a richly decorated, embroidered garment worn by the priests at High Mass. And it still survives. And the reason why we're fairly sure that it's linked to Elizabeth and Henry is that there is a rebus on that chasuble, which is a rebus is like a play on words, a pun on words for somebody's name. And there is a barrel or a tun with, I think it's MR, the initials MR, more ton. And so it's believed that this belonged to the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, who, as I mentioned, had died in 1500. And therefore it was available to give. And this highlights actually one of the things that we see Elizabeth doing throughout this progress. She's constantly either sending people to give offerings at high altars or perhaps doing it for herself on occasion, but she certainly sends people on her behalf. All the way through, we see this happening. She's obviously praying for the safe delivery of a child, which, as we know, was sadly not to be. And this perhaps fits into that she gives a gift or gives an offering at Monmouth Priory. And incredibly, this chasuble still survives in the most phenomenal state. I got to see it. It belongs to the Roman Catholic Church in Monmouth, and they allowed me to go and see it. And it was quite a thrill, as you can imagine, to see it in person and to think that this had a direct result. And actually, I think it's something that a lot of people really don't know about as a Tudor artifact.
Yes, no, that sounds amazing. I don't know if I'd heard of that one before.
Yeah, well, I contacted Illyri Lynn, who you know as the ex-curator of historic dress at Hampton Court, and she'd never heard of it. That's kind of how unknown it is. There is the other chasuble is at Skenfrith, and I got to go and see those, and they have the most unbelievable collection of 15th and 16th century religious vestments. They just kept bringing them out. Do you want to see this one? Do you want to see this one? I'm like, in the end, I was 16th century chasuble blind. I was just like, oh yeah, there's another 16th
there's
century.
Another one.
Like, yeah, whatever. But it's quite incredible. No, that's not Skenfrith. That's in Abergavenny. And then there is the Skenfrith Cope, which is not related to this progress as far as I know, but is from the 16th century. And that's on public display in the little teeny weeny parish church in Skenfrith. Amazing, really. So they stop at Monmouth for a week. Then they head over to Raglan Castle. Raglan, the centrepiece of the 1502 progress. The home of the Earls of Pembroke, or at least it had been. The host there at that time was Sir Walter. There's so many Williams and Walters involved in the story, but Sir Walter Herbert was actually the host. He was still living at Raglan, even though technically he no longer owned it. Actually had gone by marriage into the hands of Charles Somerset, the future Earl of Worcester, but Sir Walter was allowed to continue to live at Raglan until the end of his life. And Raglan is a phenomenal place to visit. It's ruined, but it's a substantial building, which is unique in that, unlike many castles that were built in the early medieval period, Raglan is really a late 15th century and 16th century castle. So it's a palace fortress. It looks like a castle. It has lots of defensive features, as you would expect from a castle, but it also has lots of features that you associated with palatial living, suites of apartments, later in the Elizabethan period, long galleries being added. And it's a really fascinating place to visit. Why are they there? Well, of course, when Henry was 4 years old, Sir William Herbert, first Earl of Pembroke, became first Earl of Pembroke, laid siege to Pembroke Castle. Jasper Tudor, of course, guardian of little Henry, fled abroad, and Henry became the ward of Sir William Herbert, who was known as Edward IV's Master Lock in Wales. He basically ruled the region on behalf of the English crown. And little Henry spent about 8 years at Raglan in the schoolroom there, growing up alongside the little William Herbert and Walter Herbert later.
Walter, yeah.
So, and Walter, in fact, we know for sure, fought alongside Henry VII at the Battle of Bosworth, and in fact sent Henry a gift every year on the anniversary of the battle. Forever, presumed until he died, or until one of them died. I think Henry VII died first, but I can't quite remember. So they obviously were very close, and it's quite poignant to think of Henry riding up to Raglan, the memories that must have flooded back from 20, 30 years earlier. And they spent, again, I think it was about it was a week that they spent at Raglan.
And were they there on the anniversary of the battle, Sarah?
They were there between the 19th and 28th. You're absolutely right. So, yeah.
I wonder how they celebrated it.
Yeah, with a lot of stories, I imagine. Do you remember when?
Yeah, exactly. Goodness.
Now, the lady, not Sir Walter's wife, but the actual lady of the castle, Elizabeth, was cousin to Elizabeth of York. She was daughter of Mary Woodville. But we don't know whether she was present or not. We just know that, we hear, for example, of Elizabeth of York receiving her pair of clavichords there. So gifts are received. Again, we don't have a lot more detail, but it was clearly a time for reminiscence and relaxing. And I think it was Henry's only visit back to Wales, wasn't it? After he hadn't been since he marched through to the Battle of Bosworth. And I don't think he went again, as far as I know, but I'm I haven't studied that, so I might be wrong. Then we're on the return journey. So we're on the homeward journey. They pass back through Chepstow, wonderful castle at Chepstow. If any of your listeners are in the area, do stop. It's formidable, but I'm not going to spend any more time there. And then on to Berkeley Castle, at the end of August, 29th to the 3rd. So they lingered a bit at Berkeley. It was Crown property. If you remember the story, that Lord Berkeley basically said to Henry VII, he was actually, I got a bit of detail on this recently when I visited Berkeley. He'd fallen out with basically his family and the heir. And to basically thwart them and to annoy them intensely, he did a bargain with Henry VII to say, I'll give you my castle if you give me a marquisate and if I can become Earl Marshal of England during my lifetime. And when you run out of male heirs, the castle will revert to our family. And hence, Berkeley Castle came into Crown ownership. So it was Crown ownership when Henry and Elizabeth were there and remained so until the death of Edward VI. I'm going to keep moving, Natalie. We're on our last stop now, at least as far as we're concerned. They move on from Berkeley, have a brief overnight stop at Bedveston Castle. What a real little hidden gem that is. But again, I don't think we've probably got time to linger too long. You can see it. You can see it's private residence. You can go down to the church. And as you go down to the church, you will see the ruins. And as I said to you before, the privy apartments, the main 2 tower blocks still stand, but are in a very, very bad state of repairs. In fact, I just wish somebody would come and just stabilize the whole building because it's clearly in danger. Anyway, finally, we are heading back into the Cotswold wool country and we come to the town of Fairford in Gloucestershire. Actually, I should just say they also go to Coates Place, probably pass through Cirencester. Again, I'm not going to linger, but arriving at Fairford where they stay again for about 4 days at Fairford. And this is where we loop back to the story of the Cotswold wool merchants, because you've got Northleach, Cirencester and Fairford were 3 of the most prominent centres for the medieval and Tudor wool trade. They were incredibly wealthy. If you visit Cirencester, you'll see the fabulous church, which definitely has a number of, and it's got a number of really interesting artefacts, including the ceiling bosses of the coats of arms of Henry VII in this beautiful fan vaulted ceiling in one of the side chapels, which very much apes the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, but in miniature version. And then we won't even mention the Anne Boleyn Cup there. I've mentioned it. Anyway, they were heading to Fairford to stay with another, possibly the wealthiest of wool merchants in the whole area. And that was the Tame family. They had a beautiful manor house that they'd inherited. I think at one stage it had belonged to George, Duke of Clarence, I think. But by this stage, John Twiningho, who was the kind of senior guy, and his son-in-law, John Tame, had basically joined forces and they had obviously acquired the property. They started to rebuild the parish church, which we'll come to in a moment because it's an extremely important part of this story. And Henry knew them and he'd done business with them before. There is records of very lucrative deals that he'd done. And they were passing through and they were staying with old friends, but business associates. And I really cannot imagine that this wasn't an opportunity to do a little bit of business and, press the flesh and keep relationships well oiled should Henry need them. But the church I mentioned is still there and it was rebuilt by the Tame family. And at the beginning of around about the time of the 1502 progress, and slightly beforehand, they started to install the stained glass windows into the rebuilt church. Those stained glass windows, it took about 20 years for them to be completed in the round, but they still survive. And they are probably one of the most amazing set of Tudor stained glass that you'll see anywhere in the country. And it's incredible because it's in this little parish church. So if you go and visit, you're not going to be crowded out by anybody else. There'll always be a guide on hand because the church, the windows are so precious. They never allow the church to be unattended when it's open, but they'll be very willing for you to talk about the history. Just beware of the one or two little, how can I say this, embellishments that might be coming your way about who you can see in the glass. Because supposedly certain figures from the Tudor court are shown in the glass. I'm on the fence about this. Samantha Harper, who I went round the church with, said, no, it's just a load of, it's legend. However, there is one guy that looks distinctively like Wolsey. I mean, really like Wolsey.
I had read that as well, that they were all the sort of Tudor figures. So isn't that interesting?
So anyway, it's really a fantastic set to see. You'll also see the tomb of John Tame by the high altar. So he was buried there, and there's a memorial to I think it's his son on the wall, who carried on the Tame tradition and also welcomed Henry VIII, who visited Fairford in 1520, hot on the tales of the Field of Cloth of Gold. And nobody quite knows why. It's a bit of a mystery. He could have been going to see the completed set of windows. Indeed, as Sam said to me, was he actually with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York on that progress? Was he there because he just spent a shed load of cash at the Field of Cloth of Gold and needed to go and recoup some of that, and so did some schmoozing? Was he just invited along to, because the windows had been associated with his parents and he was invited as a special guest? We don't know, but it's interesting to muse on that. So this sees us through to the 14th of September. Autumn is now encroaching upon the land, and this particular loop of the 1502 progress is coming to an end. The pair head back to the old manor of Langley, then on to Woodstock, and then down past, I think they go VII on the way back to Richmond. But as I say, I haven't studied that part of the progress. So goodness me, Gosh, I've talked a lot there. I do hope that wasn't too much.
No, that was fabulous. I love this particular progress. And so, we've said that this wasn't about pomp and ceremony, this particular journey, but were there any other major events that kind of spring to mind, or have we sort of covered most things?
Yeah, I think we've covered them. I just wanted to reiterate how this is about the ordinary, really. Elizabeth, as we know, was not very well at the beginning of the progress. Was she having a hard time with her pregnancy? We know she made multiple offerings, but we see her relaxing, giving and receiving gifts. We see her corresponding with family members like Catherine of Aragon, for example. There's the opportunity simply just to catch up with old friends, and we see her constantly keeping an eye on the needs of her household, her family, providing them with clothing, ordering materials for various items of clothing to be made up, but also her household as well, the uniforms that they would wear. So she's keeping an eye on that and ordering materials all the time. And then we've got the couple, as I say, just mixing with friends, schmoozing with wealthy patrons. And so it's actually fairly eventless from at least the Queen's chamber books point of view. But I don't know that, like 1535, there's so much drama going on around that whole thing. This is wonderfully, blissfully dramaless, which is probably exactly what they both needed at this particular time.
Yeah, sounds like it, given all those events you talked about earlier. So just to kind of start wrapping things up, can you tell us a little bit about what happens when the couple actually return home to London?
Yeah, so just to round up the story, really, I suppose the most important thing is what happens with Elizabeth's pregnancy. As we know, she was at the Tower of London when she went into labour. She gave birth to a daughter, but sadly, both that daughter and Elizabeth died of puerperal fever within a few days. And it's tragic, isn't it? She dies on her birthday, which is just so sad. And I just feel so sad just thinking about it for poor Henry. They'd had this wonderful summer together, must have been full of lovely memories of time shared away. And now his devoted wife and companion had died another person to die on him, basically. It was, he must have thought with the death of two sons, it couldn't get too much worse. And then his wife dies, and you can see why he was devastated, and, maybe why that started to change his character to that sort of gnarly, tight-fisted, small-minded monarch that I think a lot of people see Henry as, because we focus on those last few years of his reign.
Yeah, it's so much grief they went through, really, such tragedy. And I think there's one account that moved me a lot, and I think he calls a doctor, but the doctor is, I can't remember exactly where the doctor is, but the doctor rides hard all night to try and get there. But there's no saving her, obviously, by that point. But those little records can be so powerful, because you just imagine them waiting for this person to get there, waiting to see what's going to happen. And I know there'd already been swaddling and things ordered for the baby, and then of course the baby dies. So it is a heartbreaking end to the story. Wow, Sarah, what a journey we've been on together in this episode. It's amazing. And, I love these locations. And it's wonderful that there are some left that our listeners can perhaps go and visit if they'd like to. But there is one final question I have for you. You've been very generous with your time already, and that is for a Tudor takeaway. So I like to ask my guests for something perhaps for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. You've already given us lots of things to check out, but do you have one final takeaway for us?
Well, I suppose actually I'm building on what I've already said, but it's what the Tudor Travel Guide is all about. And I wouldn't be being me if I didn't say it. I would just urge you to pick a place that you've never visited before and just research as much as you can about its Tudor owner and its history and any events that took place there. And then just go and visit if you can. Go and stand and immerse yourself in the building. Touch the walls. Just see what comes to you, because you will not be disappointed. And I know that's easier for some people to do than others. But as I say, I have to be true to the Tudor Travel Guide and what moves me the most. And so that would be my Tudor takeaway.
Lovely. And yes, if you can get to one of these locations, it is an amazing feeling, I think, standing there and knowing that that's exactly where they once were. So,
well, that's a fantastic place, actually, to say that we are, as part of Simply Tudor Tours, inspired by the research and writing, are running our tour around this based on this progress. So 1502, the year that shook the Tudor throne, when we will be going in the footsteps of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. We're going to be running that, Natalie, between the 6th and the 12th of July in 2026. So there's lots of time to save pennies if that is something that you are interested in doing. And along the way, we'll be visiting 10 locations. So obviously, many of them that we've talked about today. And we'll also be seeing that Monmouth chasuble in person. So we are very lucky, had to work quite hard to get to be able, because obviously they're very protective of it. Mm-hmm. So we'll be able to go and see that in person. And we're going to be staying at Thornbury for a couple of nights.
Love
and enjoying some Tudor pastimes along the way. So there'll be a lovely mixture of both seeing and hearing about Tudor history. We'll be meeting guest experts along the way, including O'Leary Lynn and Nathan Amen. But we'll also be immersing ourselves in a slice of Tudor life, which is what we love to do at Simply Tudor Tours. It's not just about the seeing, it's about the kind of tasting it for yourself. So 6th to the 12th of July, 2026. If folk are interested, just need to hop on over to www.simplytudortours.com. There is a tab there that's about our tours, and you can find out about all of the tours we got going on, including this one.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I have to say, Thornbury is one of my favorite places. So staying 2 nights is a dream come true, and those speakers sound brilliant. So fantastic. I'll add a link to the Simply Tudor Tours website in the show notes to make it nice and easy for people to find it. But Sarah, thank you. This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk Tudors with us.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure as ever. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.